One of the most powerful things you can do to change your brain, your behavior, PRB, and ultimately your life is to show up every single day, regardless of how you feel, regardless of whether motivation is there or not, because here's the truth, backed by neuroscience, action precedes motivation, not the other way around. When you show up, especially when it's hard, you send a signal to your nervous system that says, this matters. You begin to rewire your brain's circuitry for discipline, focus, and resilience. You begin to train your dopamine system not for cheap rewards, but for deep, meaningful progress. This is not about grinding mindlessly. It's about leveraging your biology in your favor. It's about understanding that consistency is a neurochemical signal and repetition is what builds identity. So, today, I want to explore how forcing yourself to show up, even in small ways, can literally reshape your brain, expand your capacity, and unlock levels of performance and purpose that most people never touch. Not because they weren't capable, but because they didn't consistently show up. Action drives neuroplasticity more than motivation ever will. This is a foundational principle in neuroscience and behavior change. When we talk about neuroplasticity, we're talking about the brain's ability to change, adapt, and rewire itself in response to experience. The most powerful signal for neuroplastic change isn't how inspired you feel or how motivated you are, it's what you actually do repeatedly, especially under conditions of resistance or difficulty. Motivation is unreliable. It fluctuates with mood, energy levels, and external circumstances. But action is controllable. Action is deliberate. And action is what teaches the brain what to prioritize. Every time you take a specific action, you're casting a vote neurologically for the kind of person you're becoming. That's not philosophy, it's physiology. Inside the brain, when you initiate movement or behavior, especially toward a challenging goal, a cascade of neuromodulators is released. One of the most important is dopamine. Dopamine is not simply the chemical of pleasure. More accurately, it's the molecule of pursuit. It increases motivation by amplifying the perceived value of a goal and energizing behavior toward that goal. But here's the key, dopamine is released in greater quantities not before action, but during it, and most especially after effortful action that's tied to some kind of meaning or intention. That means if you sit around waiting for motivation to act, you're reversing the natural sequence. The biology is clear, it's the action that leads to the neurochemical state you're hoping to achieve. This is particularly true when the action you take is hard. Let's say you don't feel like working out or writing or showing up to that job or having that hard conversation. If you override that resistance and take the first step, however small, you trigger a neural loop involving the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and the midbrain. This loop begins to strengthen the more often you push through. That strengthening is neuroplasticity in motion. The brain starts to make it easier to act the next time. You're not just doing something difficult, you're literally reshaping the brain's circuitry to make that behavior more accessible and automatic. And that doesn't happen through thinking about it. It happens through doing. People often wait for clarity, confidence, or ideal conditions to begin something. But waiting doesn't tell the brain anything. The neurons involved in that future action remain idle. They don't fire. And when they don't fire, they don't wire. Neuroplasticity requires signal. It requires energy. It requires repetition. And that comes from movement, from engagement, from stepping forward when your emotions might be telling you pull back. This is one of the reasons that deliberate, even uncomfortable action is so potent. It not only creates momentum, it rewires your emotional relationship with effort itself. The more you act in the absence of motivation, the more your brain learns that action is not dependent on how you feel. That realization is liberating. It gives you control. There is also the principle of Hebbian learning, often summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. When you force yourself to take a repeated action, even in a low motivation state, your brain links the behavior with the outcome and it starts to automate the response. For example, if you force yourself to wake up and go for a run every morning, at first it will feel like resistance. You'll negotiate with yourself, procrastinate, feel friction. But after enough repetition, that behavior begins to require less and less conscious energy. You begin to crave the run, not because it's easy, but because your brain has associated that action with reward, whether physical, mental, or emotional. And that craving, that anticipation, is a sign that neuroplasticity has taken place. Another concept to understand is the role of the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in error detection, conflict monitoring, and adapting to change. When you consistently show up and take action in spite of conflicting emotions, this region becomes more efficient. It's better able to manage internal conflict and resolve it in favor of action. Over time, this helps build psychological resilience. You're training your brain to act in alignment with your values, not just your mood. You're training your mind to be a tool, not a tyrant. This doesn't come from waiting for the perfect mindset. It comes from acting in ways that shape the mindset. In sum, action is the driver of change. It's the physical signal that tells your brain this matters. Adapt accordingly. The more you act, the more your brain changes. And the more your brain changes, the easier it becomes to continue that action. This is a feedback loop that strengthens over time. Motivation might help you start, but it's action that ensures progress. Consistency teaches your brain what truly matters to you. The human brain is not only a processor of thoughts and experiences, it is a pattern detection machine. It observes what you do repeatedly, and from those repetitions, it extracts meaning. If you consistently take action in a particular direction, your brain interprets that as significance. It begins to allocate more cognitive and emotional resources to that behavior. It reinforces the neural circuits involved and eventually makes that action easier and more automatic. This is not just about forming habits, this is about sculpting your identity through behavior. When you show up day after day, regardless of how inspired you feel, you are training your nervous system to prioritize a specific outcome. Consistency is how you communicate value to your brain. It's how your subconscious decides what is worth pursuing, what deserves focus, and what should be deprioritized. If you only take action when it feels good or when external conditions are perfect, your brain gets mixed signals. It doesn't know whether that behavior is essential or just an occasional whim. But when you repeat a task daily, even in small doses, the brain flags that task as important. Neural resources shift toward making that behavior smoother, more fluid, and more integrated into your routine. This is particularly evident in the way the brain structures memory and learning. The hippocampus, which is involved in memory consolidation, responds differently to repeated experiences versus novel or sporadic ones. Repeated experiences, especially those tied to effort and attention, are more likely to be encoded into long-term memory. That's because the brain interprets repetition as relevance. The same goes for motor learning and skill acquisition. Whether you're learning an instrument, practicing a sport, or building a business, it's the consistent engagement that allows the brain to optimize performance through adaptation. Even when you don't see obvious progress on the surface, deep-level neural restructuring is happening. It just takes time to emerge. Dopamine, the molecule associated with motivation and reward, also plays a role here. Consistent effort, especially when it's self-initiated, creates a steady release of dopamine tied to the act of showing up. This builds what neuroscientists call intrinsic motivation driven not by external rewards, but by the internal satisfaction of persistence and progress. The more you reinforce a pattern of daily engagement, the more your dopamine system aligns itself with that effort. It begins to anticipate the reward that comes not from achieving the final result, but from the act of engaging the process itself. In the background, your autonomic nervous system also adapts. With consistency, you experience less physiological resistance. That feeling of dread or heaviness that often comes before taking action starts to diminish. Your baseline response to effort changes. This is because the brain and body are not static, they respond to what you ask of them most frequently. If you demand reliability, focus, and perseverance every day, the system gradually shifts to support that demand. It's no longer an occasional gear shift into discipline, it becomes the default operating mode. And this isn't something that requires massive action, it requires repeated action. Another critical area affected by consistency is the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function, decision-making, and goal-directed behavior. The prefrontal cortex is strengthened through use. The more often you engage in focused effort, the better this region becomes at filtering distractions, regulating impulses, and maintaining long-term objectives in the face of short-term discomfort. You're not just getting better at your task, you're becoming more mentally organized, more emotionally stable, and more cognitively efficient. That transformation starts with repeated engagement. You show your brain again and again what matters, and the brain begins to automate the focus and discipline required to maintain it. Even on a deeper level, your brain begins to reshape your self-image based on what you consistently do. If you show up daily to train, write, build, create, or serve, your internal narrative shifts. You start to think of yourself as someone who does hard things, who follows through, who acts regardless of mood. This narrative then fuels further action, creating a powerful feedback loop. Your identity becomes linked to consistency, and your behavior begins to reinforce that identity. It's no longer something you're trying to do, it's who you are becoming. Consistency also builds emotional resilience. By facing the same task or challenge repeatedly, especially when it's uncomfortable, you become desensitized to fear, self-doubt, or anxiety around that action. You learn that showing up doesn't always feel good at first, but that feelings don't have to dictate your behavior. Over time, emotional reactivity decreases, and your tolerance for discomfort increases. This is not just mental toughness, it's neurobiological conditioning. Your emotional circuits begin to adapt. They stop firing in opposition to effort and instead start to support it. Through consistency, you create a kind of internal certainty, not about outcomes, but about your own behavior. You no longer have to wonder whether you'll follow through. You stop negotiating with yourself in moments of weakness. This reliability becomes a form of self-trust, and that trust compounds. Your brain begins to anchor itself in that predictability, and from that foundation, you can begin to reach for higher levels of focus, creativity, and growth. Discomfort is not a sign to stop. It's a signal that adaptation is happening. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of personal growth, both physically and mentally. From a biological standpoint, discomfort is not inherently negative. It is data. It's the nervous system's way of indicating that you are entering a zone where energy demands are increasing, where familiar patterns are being challenged, and where the brain and body are being asked to operate beyond their current baseline. This is exactly the zone where plasticity lives. Discomfort is a marker that you are no longer coasting on autopilot. You're pushing into territory that requires new wiring, new strength, new capacities. In the brain, discomfort often shows up as resistance, fatigue, or even anxiety when approaching a task that stretches your limits. This is because your limbic system, particularly the amygdala, is wired to detect anything that deviates from comfort and predictability. It's a survival mechanism. The amygdala is trained to alert you when you are stepping into uncertainty. But what it can't distinguish is the difference between actual danger and voluntary challenge. It sends the same signal whether you're about to speak on stage, start a new habit, or engage in deep focus work. Learning to interpret this signal not as a warning but as a green light is essential. Discomfort tells you that the conditions for growth are present. It is evidence that your system is being stressed in a way that promotes transformation. On the neural level, when you engage in an activity that pushes your limits, the brain recruits more cortical resources to manage the demand. For example, if you're learning a complex skill or pushing through mental resistance in your daily work, more areas of the prefrontal cortex become engaged. This focused activation increases synaptic activity, which lays the groundwork for neuroplastic change. But this process isn't smooth. It often feels frustrating, slow, or emotionally taxing. That is the nature of adaptation. The brain is not designed to change effortlessly. It's designed to change in response to pressure and necessity. That pressure is what signals to the nervous system that change is worth the metabolic cost. Physiologically, this principle is equally relevant. When you train your body, whether through exercise, cold exposure, or fasting, the physical discomfort you experience is not simply something to endure. It is a stimulus. When you expose your muscles to load or your cardiovascular system to exertion, discomfort arises because your current capacity is being tested. But it is precisely that testing that initiates repair and reinforcement. Hormones like adrenaline, cortisol, and growth hormone are mobilized. Mitochondrial efficiency improves. Muscle fibers are broken down and rebuilt stronger. The same logic applies to the mind. Emotional and cognitive discomfort are the catalysts for mental toughness, adaptability, and clarity. Another critical component is the reward system, specifically how dopamine functions in the context of effort. Dopamine release is heightened not when things are easy, but when effort is high and sustained. Studies show that dopamine levels increase significantly during the pursuit of challenging goals, especially when those goals involve overcoming resistance or discomfort. This is your brain's way of incentivizing hard things. It recognizes that the struggle has value, and it rewards you not just after success, but during the effort. When you learn to associate discomfort with reward rather than threat, your relationship to effort transforms. You stop seeing discomfort as something to avoid and instead begin to seek it strategically. This is also why controlled exposure to discomfort builds resilience. When you choose to place yourself in challenging environments regularly, whether that's mental, emotional, or physical, you are building what researchers call stress inoculation. Just like a vaccine trains the immune system by introducing a manageable dose of a virus, exposing yourself to controlled discomfort trains your nervous system to handle greater levels of stress without overreacting. The prefrontal cortex becomes more efficient at regulating emotional responses, the sympathetic nervous system becomes less reactive, and you develop a more accurate internal gauge of what you can actually handle. Perhaps the most powerful effect of embracing discomfort is the long-term change it creates in your identity. Every time you face discomfort and move through it, you are proving something to yourself. You are demonstrating that you are not controlled by temporary feelings. You are building an internal narrative of capability, of grit, of agency. And that narrative begins to take root. It starts to override the old stories of avoidance, hesitation, or fear. This is not just motivational language, it is neuroscience. Self-belief is a reflection of repeated action in the face of resistance. And discomfort is the arena where that repetition has the most impact. What makes discomfort so important is that it reveals your edges. It shows you exactly where the work is. It exposes the areas that are underdeveloped, undertrained, or underutilized, and it offers you the opportunity to develop them. When you stop interpreting discomfort as a stop sign and begin seeing it as a compass pointing toward growth, your entire strategy changes. You stop chasing ease and start seeking challenge. You stop avoiding resistance and start leaning into it with curiosity and intention. This shift rewires the brain. It refines your focus. It sharpens your will. And with enough repetition, it becomes your default setting. The dopamine system rewards progress, not perfection. This is one of the most powerful principles in neuroscience when it comes to motivation, drive, and long-term consistency. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the chemical of pleasure or reward, but that's only part of the story. In reality, dopamine is much more about the anticipation and pursuit of goals than the final outcome. It's the neurotransmitter that fuels effort, energizes action, and helps us stay on course, especially when tasks are challenging or delayed in gratification. When you understand how dopamine works, you begin to realize that progress, even small, incremental progress, is more neurologically valuable than achieving some perfect, flawless outcome. In the brain, dopamine is released when we perceive that we are moving toward a desired state. This release doesn't wait for perfection. In fact, waiting for perfection delays dopamine signaling and weakens motivation over time. What the dopamine system wants is movement, effort towards something meaningful. That effort signals to your brain that your actions are aligned with a purpose, and in response, your brain boosts dopamine levels to keep you engaged. This loop effort, followed by dopamine, drives forward momentum. It creates a kind of internal propulsion system, one that doesn't require everything to be going perfectly. It only requires that you keep moving forward. This is crucial in the context of building habits, learning skills, or pursuing long-term goals. Many people derail their progress because they're waiting for the perfect time, the perfect plan, or the perfect execution. But the brain doesn't need perfect conditions to grow. It needs consistent input that signals value. When you make a small improvement, take a small risk, or complete a small task, even if the outcome isn't flawless, your brain still releases dopamine in response to the effort. That release reinforces the behavior. It makes you more likely to repeat it. Over time, those repetitions become patterns, and those patterns become part of your identity. It all starts with progress. On a structural level, dopamine pathways involve several key regions, including the ventral tegmental area, vita, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. These areas work together to evaluate goals, assign value to actions, and regulate the feeling of motivation. When you make forward progress, even on a micro scale, the vita activates and sends dopamine to the nucleus accumbens. This creates a sense of reward and satisfaction, not because you finished something perfectly, but because you did something meaningful. The brain is trained through experience to associate that kind of movement with success. This process is how motivation becomes self-sustaining. There's also a concept known as dopamine layering, where you intentionally connect effort with internal rewards. For example, if you set a goal to write 200 words a day and you actually sit down and do it, even if it's messy or disorganized, you train your brain to associate that effort with dopamine. Over time, you won't need external validation or outcomes to feel fulfilled by the process. You'll begin to crave the act of showing up and making progress. That craving is a sign that your dopamine system has been recalibrated toward internal growth rather than external achievement. And once that happens, consistency becomes easier and more intuitive. Importantly, the dopamine system is sensitive to novelty and change. If you expect a perfect outcome every time and you fail to reach it, the system begins to downregulate. You lose interest. But if you stay focused on small wins, on learning from mistakes, and on experimenting with effort, you keep the dopamine cycle active. You maintain motivation not because everything is going right, but because you are actively engaging with the process. This perspective shift, valuing progress over perfection, protects you from burnout, discouragement, and stagnation. It allows you to maintain forward momentum through challenges, setbacks, and uncertainty. The most successful people, whether in science, athletics, business, or the arts, all understand this on some level. They track their progress, they celebrate small gains, they find satisfaction in iteration and refinement. They don't wait for the perfect version of their work before moving forward. They act, assess, adjust, and continue. This behavior aligns perfectly with how the dopamine system is built to operate. It is designed to reinforce momentum, not mastery. And when your strategy matches your biology, you start to feel energized by the journey itself. There's also a psychological benefit to this approach. When you focus on progress, you reduce anxiety around outcomes. Perfection often creates pressure, and that pressure can activate the sympathetic nervous system, leading to stress, self-doubt, or paralysis. But when you focus on progress, your parasympathetic system is more likely to stay balanced. You remain calm, present, and focused. You take action from a place of curiosity rather than fear. This balance helps sustain energy and motivation over the long term, even when external circumstances fluctuate. Progress is not linear, and the dopamine system understands that. What matters is that there is a general trend forward, even if there are dips along the way. Each small step signals value to your brain. Each act of showing up reinforces the loop. Over time, this creates a momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to stop. You're not chasing perfection, you're engaging in progress, and that is exactly what the brain is wired to reward. Discipline is not something you wake up with, it's something you train like a muscle. Every time you choose action over avoidance, structure over chaos, or intention over impulse, you are building a system within your brain that makes discipline more accessible the next time. The human brain is built on circuits that strengthen through use. Just like lifting weights builds muscle fibers, exerting willpower and following through on your intentions strengthens the neural pathways involved in focus, self-control, and delayed gratification. The more often you activate these circuits, the more efficient they become. And eventually, what once felt like resistance becomes your normal operating mode. In neuroscience, this process is called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience. Each disciplined action, no matter how small, is like a vote cast for the person you're becoming. Those actions might not feel significant in the moment, but they are carving grooves into your neural structure. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functions like planning, decision-making, and regulating emotions, becomes more efficient with repeated use. As you train discipline, the prefrontal cortex strengthens its ability to override impulses from deeper, more reactive areas of the brain like the limbic system. That shift gives you more control over your choices, more clarity in stressful moments, and more momentum in pursuing long-term goals. Discipline is also supported by changes in the neurochemical environment of the brain. Dopamine, often associated with motivation and pleasure, is released not just when you achieve a goal, but when you exert effort toward that goal. This means that every act of discipline, every time you show up, do the work, resist distraction, triggers a neurochemical reward. That reward reinforces the behavior, making it easier to repeat in the future. Over time, you start to feel a sense of internal satisfaction from effort itself. This is how people shift from relying on external rewards to being driven by intrinsic motivation. They've trained their brains to associate effort with meaning. The structure of your day, your routines, and your environment also play a crucial role in building discipline. The brain thrives on predictability. When you create consistent rituals, waking up at the same time, planning your day, committing to specific actions, you reduce the cognitive load required to make decisions. You conserve mental energy by automating parts of your life. This frees up bandwidth for more complex forms of discipline like deep focus, emotional regulation, and sustained creative work. You're not just building discipline through willpower, you're engineering your lifestyle to support disciplined behavior. One of the most overlooked aspects of discipline is how it interacts with your physiology. Sleep, nutrition, hydration, and physical movement all impact your capacity for discipline. The brain is a biological organ, and it requires energy and balance to function at a high level. When you are sleep-deprived or undernourished, the prefrontal cortex becomes less effective. You become more reactive, more impulsive, and more prone to distraction. On the other hand, when you prioritize rest, recovery, and physical health, you increase your ability to stay disciplined under pressure. This connection between biology and behavior is essential to understand. You cannot separate your mental performance from your physical state. Another core component of training discipline is learning to navigate failure and friction without giving up. The disciplined mind doesn't avoid obstacles, it expects them. It doesn't crumble under setbacks, it adapts. This mindset is trainable. When you encounter resistance, whether it's mental, emotional, or circumstantial, you have the opportunity to build resilience. Each time you push through when you feel like quitting, you send a powerful signal to your brain: this task matters. That signal strengthens the motivational circuits in your brain and increases your capacity to stay committed next time. Over time, your threshold for difficulty expands and your tolerance for discomfort grows. You become less reactive and more grounded. Discipline is also amplified by identity. When you start to see yourself as someone who follows through, someone who keeps promises to themselves, your brain starts to align your behavior with that self-image. Identity-based discipline is far more powerful than goal-based discipline. Goals are external, identity is internal. When your daily actions reinforce a disciplined identity, the need for motivation decreases. You act not because you feel like it, but because that's who you are. And with each repetition, that identity becomes more deeply embedded in your neural networks. There's a feedback loop here. The more you act with discipline, the more you believe you're capable of discipline, and the more likely you are to take disciplined action in the future. This loop compounds. It doesn't matter how small the action is. Making your bed, resisting a distraction, finishing a task before the deadline, these are all micro repetitions that contribute to macro-level change. Over time, they create a structure within your brain and life that supports consistent effort, even on the hard days. Training discipline also involves detaching from emotions in the moment of decision-making. The brain often uses emotion to guide behavior, but emotions are temporary. Discipline asks you to rise above the moment, to act based on values, principles, and long-term vision rather than immediate feeling. This is where the power of the trained mind becomes clear. You learn to recognize the voice of resistance, observe it without reacting, and move forward anyway. That is not natural, it's developed through practice. And the more you practice, the more your brain normalizes that process. Showing up every day changes your brain's default settings. The human brain is a prediction machine. It constantly scans your environment and internal state to determine what's likely to happen next. When you act consistently, even in small ways, your brain begins to recognize patterns and rewire itself accordingly. Repetition doesn't just create habits, it reshapes the fundamental assumptions your nervous system makes about what kind of person you are, what you're capable of, and what actions are necessary each day. This process doesn't rely on talent or motivation, it relies on consistency. The act of showing up becomes the input your brain uses to establish a new baseline for effort, behavior, and identity. Neuroscience refers to this phenomenon as automaticity. It's the point at which a behavior no longer requires active, conscious effort. When you first start a new behavior, whether it's waking up early, journaling, exercising, or doing deep work, it feels effortful because the brain is working hard to encode a new pattern. The prefrontal cortex is heavily engaged, overseeing each step, weighing decisions, and managing resistance. But over time, as the behavior is repeated under similar conditions, neural efficiency improves. The task becomes encoded in deeper structures like the basal ganglia, the region responsible for habit formation. Once that happens, showing up is no longer a question, it becomes automatic. And when something becomes automatic, it costs less energy and creates less friction. This shift is critical for long-term progress because energy and attention are limited resources. If you have to debate with yourself every single morning about whether or not to do the thing you know you need to do, you're burning unnecessary cognitive fuel. But when showing up becomes your default setting, you bypass that inner conflict. The brain thrives on simplicity and predictability. It prefers to follow established patterns because doing so conserves energy. When showing up becomes part of your identity and daily rhythm, the brain rewards it with ease and momentum. You no longer need to summon motivation every time you simply act. This is also how confidence is built. Many people think confidence is something you need before taking action, but it's actually the result of taking action repeatedly. Every time you show up, regardless of how you feel, you send a signal to your brain, I am the kind of person who follows through. That signal is more powerful than any affirmation or visualization. It's backed by evidence, your own behavior. The brain takes note of that evidence and begins to revise your self-concept. This is how you move from self-doubt to self-trust, not by waiting to feel ready, but by creating a record of consistent action. You're training your brain to believe in your reliability. Showing up every day also alters how you process stress and setbacks. When you show up consistently, you develop what psychologists call behavioral resilience. This is the capacity to continue acting in alignment with your goals even when conditions are unfavorable. The nervous system becomes less reactive to minor obstacles and more focused on task execution. This doesn't mean you stop feeling stress, it means your relationship to stress changes. You develop a kind of emotional agility. You're less likely to be derailed by bad moods, external criticism, or mental chatter because the habit of showing up acts like an anchor. It gives your brain something to return to, even in moments of chaos. Another crucial effect of daily consistency is the way it affects time perception. When you live reactively, each day feels unpredictable, scattered, and fragmented. The brain struggles to find coherence, and this lack of structure can trigger anxiety. But when you build rituals around showing up, whether that's starting work at the same time, doing focus sessions, or having a consistent evening routine, you create temporal landmarks. These repeated moments give your days structure and rhythm, which the brain interprets as safety and control. That sense of control, even over a small part of your day, has a regulating effect on the entire nervous system. It reduces the chaos and gives you a sense of grounded momentum. Daily action also increases your brain's ability to focus. Each time you show up and engage in deep work, you're training attentional systems like the anterior cingulate cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to stay engaged longer and resist distraction more effectively. Focus is not a trait, it's a skill that is built through repetition. When you skip days or work inconsistently, these circuits lose sharpness. But when you consistently engage them, even for short sessions, their strength compounds. Over time, you become less reactive to external noise and more capable of sustained, intentional work. This improved focus spills over into every area of your life, from conversations to creativity to problem solving. One of the most underestimated outcomes of showing up daily is the trust you build with your future self. Most people think of the future as vague and far away, but the brain treats your future self as a real person, someone it can either trust or not trust. Every time you break a promise to yourself, the connection between present and future you weakens. But every time you show up, especially when it's hard, that trust deepens. Your brain begins to expect that future you will follow through because present you keeps doing it. That trust creates inner alignment, reducing the conflict between what you want and what you do. It creates a feedback loop of self-integrity and discipline that supports sustainable growth.